I once met a woman who was homeless at the time. Everything she had, she kept in a trolley which she pushed around the city. I was writing a book in the mall, of all places, and she was sat a few tables away from me. It was just us. Out of the blue, she asked what I was writing, and I told her. I asked what she was reading, and I don't remember what it was. We talked for a while, and it was one of the most fascinating conversations I have ever had, and with someone that I never thought I would have it with. We talked about life and her past, and how Dostoevsky captures the toil of the human soul. In the end, I asked if I could get her something. I could buy her lunch, or a place to stay, or if I could get her a book, because she loved talking about literature. And she said to me, I would love a copy of the New Testament in the original Greek, or a book of Dostoevsky's works. I never saw her again, but I knew from that moment that I needed to read Dostoevsky and learn about the toil of the human soul. So, here I am, with Crime and Punishment, another classic author that I just never ended up reading till now. It's about this guy, Raskolnikov, for whom life has become truly terrible. He's lost his job, his way of continuing his studies, he's miserable, his mother has sacrificed everything to help him, and his own sister is basically having to prostitute herself to marry a rich man against her will. All around him, he just sees the misery of others, and often the misery of others that he has indirectly caused. He feels guilty and wrought up about it, and he doesn't know how to fix it. He can't fix it. That's a horrible place to be. It's misery that he realizes isn't just a fact of life. It's not something that he has to coexist with. It's not even, their fault that they ended up in this position. It's caused by other people. It could have been stopped if the rich and the powerful had but a little empathy. And he seems like he is the only one that sees that, right? So he's seeing this world full of injustice. In particular, he sees this wealthy pawnbroker, this old woman, and he resolves that, hey, he could kill her, and he could use her money far more wisely than she ever could. It's just money when human lives are at stake, human well-being, right? How is that not more important? It comes down to this strictly utilitarian decision. Killing her and taking her money will let him do far more good than he will ever do harm. It's not even close, not even comparable. And this is the morally complicated way that this book starts out, that you are very intuitively sympathetic towards, right? But at the same time, you don't want it to be. You don't want to live in a world where murder is sometimes justified. But it broaches quite a fundamental sociological, philosophical, moral question, and there's a lot of those in this book. Either the system is good, and the people are doing evil in spite of it, or the people are good, but the system forces them to do evil. Which is it when he decides to kill, this old woman? And Dostoevsky really sells you on the idea that Raskolnikov isn't really even a bad guy. He doesn't do this out of anger. Not really, It's not his primary motivation. It's not even jealousy. Not really. This idea of coveting what other people have. It's so much more fundamental and sympathetic than that. So right from the start, the book, is raising up these questions about the gap between the law, the system, and morality. His sister, it's not her fault that she is suffering, so whose is it? Where does that suffering come from? Russian society in St. Petersburg in particular is shown to be harsh and brutal, that it strips people of individuality, of freedom, of the ability to often be empathetic and to see others as human as themselves. And that goes both ways. It can make you better off, right? It can make you like the pawnbroker, and it can also make you far worse off, like Raskolnikov and his family and the people he knows. It's a fascinating thematic discussion, but what really impressed me is that it doesn't really moralize to you, it never feels like there is a deliberate answer that Fyodor Dostoevsky is trying to bring you to. It's much more like, here is a discussion, I'll leave it in your hands. And that's a really hard balance to toe, right? There is an undercurrent of like the spiritual and moral weight of having to live with our own actions, that is something we need to think a lot more about, and the toll that takes on our conscious effort of living. But it leaves so many other questions up for discussion, right? And I really liked that. But the thing that really shocked me, and I mean, like, for a book that was published in 1867 or something, like, the thing that shocked me was how accessible the writing, the prose was. You could easily take this for a book that is being published today. Listen to this. His nervous shudder had passed into a fever that made him feel shivering. In spite of the heat, he felt cold. With a kind of effort, he began almost unconsciously, from some inner craving, to stare at all the objects before him, as though looking for something to distract his attention, but he did not succeed, and he kept dropping every moment into brooding. You know, I have read other books from this era, and most of them are not written in this accessible a way. And I bring that up because I know that for a lot of people, reading the classics, reading older books, you know, part of the hurdle is getting over the sense of, am I even going to understand what the words are? Am I going to understand what the story is? And you feel dumb, and you don't want to feel dumb when you're reading books, right? It feels humiliating when you don't really get it. It's part of the reason that, you know, some people don't really like Shakespeare that much. But Crime and Punishment is very accessible, very readable compared to a lot of others. But on the other hand, I wouldn't call the prose in Crime and Punishment like particularly advanced. It's not super poetic. Like, you look at that quote from before and he says, his nervous shudder had passed into a fever that made him feel shivering. Like, there are clear ways that you could write that better. Look at me, like, critiquing Dostoevsky, one of the most important writers of all time. There is a lot of, you know, telling rather than showing. You know, he will constantly tell me, you know, that a character felt happy or was sad, and will describe it in ways that often aren't particularly interesting. And that's fine. You know, it's not inherently bad, but it happens a lot. It's not the most beautifully written classic novel, I'd say. It's not like Tolstoy. You know, you're not going to get Shakespeare in this writing. Though, I will note the dialogue is quite creative. The character really comes out in the dialogue. As I was kind of hinting at before, the real strength in Crime and Punishment is in its plotting and in its themes. You know, it is a psychological thriller. It's one of the kind of like first real psychological thrillers, and it really does feel like that. You know, you have this murder at the beginning and someone is trailing him, and the inner turmoil of the murderer. It is thrilling and it is deeply psychological. That much is very true. He's hiding from the law, but also wrestling with his own demons. It's intensely personal and human. And Raskolnikov's thinking, you know, is very relatable, very understandable. And that does make me sound like a murderer. I promise you, I haven't murdered anyone this year, okay? Nobody, no crime. This book was a lot more me, and to me a lot more digestible than Jane Austen's Emma, which I reviewed a while ago. But I mean, this book is a psychological thriller, and I love crime novels, so just by nature it's probably a lot closer to my personal tastes. But, like, the plotting, in terms of how he actually chooses to portray his ideas and the beats in his story, they can be really harrowing. I was reading this scene, and apparently, I didn't know this, it's quite a famous scene in the novel, but when I read it, like, it really hit me, so I can see why it's famous. There's a scene of a horse being beaten to death, and it is a hard read. It is not pleasant whatsoever. Two young fellows in the cart were just getting whips ready to help Mikolka. With the cry of "now," the mare tugged with all her might, but far from galloping could scarcely move forward. She struggled with her legs, gasping and shrinking from the blows of the 3 whips which were showered upon her like hail. The laughter in the cart and the crowd was redoubled, and Mikolka flew into a rage and furiously thrashed the mare, as though he supposed that she could gallop. You know, like, Dostoevsky, even if he's not the most creative with his words, he picks the right way to communicate his ideas that always lands really vividly. Every moment is intense, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, physically, And the narrative is really tight. I never felt like it went off on a tangent that it didn't need to go on, right? It felt very focused. I've been told to read Demons next, which is apparently even better. Now, Crime and Punishment isn't like about how society deals with crime and punishment. It's much more about the human conscience, how we reconcile ourselves with violence and crime and badness, right? Raskolnikov gets away with the murder. That's not the hard part. But how does he justify it to himself? And he goes through a lot of Okay, you're just gonna have to deal with slightly less light. How does he deal with himself, you know? There's this line, your worst sin is that you have destroyed and betrayed yourself for nothing. Basically, the real question is not, you know, how do we build a moral society, but how do we live with ourselves on our way to it? You know, we have to build a world that we can live with in our conscience. And that's a really interesting idea. No matter what punishments we impose, no matter what economic incentives there are, the ultimate question is one of the soul. And I think Dostoevsky handles that discussion really damn well. So it's a fascinating narrative. It really did pull me through. It's philosophical and deep and curious, and the characters do feel real. And yeah, I can totally recommend reading this one if you're going to pick like an old classic. Is it a Crime and Punishment to read? No, it was a crime and joy to read. Absolutely. If this sounds like you, go grab it yourself. Stay nerdy, and I will see you in the future.